In his new book, Why Does the World Exist?, author Jim Holt describes how we tend to think of the world having come into being as akin to the way we may have anticipated the start of this morning's service. By way of analogy, the author suggests as if we are waiting for the start of a concert, with those in attendance sitting in rapt expectation, fumbling through their programs, waiting for the music to begin. And so it does. Our service opened with song and our Torah reading, all but sings, Bereshit bara Elohim et hashamayim ve'et haaretz. In the beginning, God created the heavens and the earth. Ours is a most appropriate Torah reading for Rosh Hashanah morning, for today is, after all, the day on which we describe the world as having come into existence. We call this day Yom Ha'arat Olam, the day of the world's birth. Now, this said, if we're going to be honest, we ought to acknowledge that not all traditional Jewish commentators agree on that point. There are those who suggest that today is the day on which the world was conceived, and others suggest that today is the day on which the world came into the fullness of existence, and there is a minority opinion, as there typically is, that suggests the world actually began this past Wednesday, 6 days ago, and today is the day on which human beings were created. Regardless, the tradition is uniform in its understanding that today is a day on which we set aside our thoughts of things other than the origins of things and our ability to make things happen as if for the first time. Now, those of you who have heard me preach before will understand and appreciate that I only very rarely speak of my boys, of our two sons, in my sermons. But a few months ago, my younger son, Michael, asked me a question that gave rise to this sermon. From the back seat of our car, he asked, "Daddy, if God created the world, how did God create himself?" We drove on in silence for a few moments. And then I began by telling him that he had asked a really insightful question, and very smart people through the ages had asked just that very same question and had spent much time and spilled a lot of ink trying to answer that question. And yet I discovered in making my attempts to address his query, I came up short. He kept making me certain to understand that they were unsatisfying, my answers were. "Daddy," he said, "how did God create himself?" So I began by trying to explain that God is different from other things, that while children will appreciate, they intuitively understand that somehow everything was created by someone and for some purpose, God is different than that. And Michael came back and said, "Yes, but how did God create himself?" So I tried again. I suggested that God is within each one of us, and when we know, "Daddy, how did he create himself?" And so I said, "Michael, I'm going to need a little bit more time. Will you allow me some time?" And he said he would. I told him that perhaps he would let me answer him by way of a sermon, maybe on Rosh Hashanah, because that would buy me about 6 or 7 weeks. And he allowed that he would do just that, and so here we are. So sitting alone, trying to determine how I would address his question, I did what all young fathers, quickly aging fathers, those of my generation do. I turned to my phone and I asked Siri, "How did God create himself?" But Siri assured me she does not deal with theological questions. I went online and I Googled the question, and there are a plethora of answers, but it came clear very quickly that the internet was not going to be where I would find the answer that would satisfy my 4-year-old. I was on my own. And so in good rabbinic tradition, aware of the dictate from Pirkei Avot, the ethical teachings of the sages, hafachba, dechulaba, that one should turn it over and over again for the answers contained therein, I ruminated on the question. The most boring and unproductive question one can ask of any religion is whether or not it is true. So recently wrote Alain de Botton in his new book, Religion for Atheists, a non-believer's guide to the use of religion. This morning, then, as we embark on an exploration not of the world's origins, but rather on how God comes into being, let us, in the author's words, rescue that which is beautiful and touching and wise from that which no longer seems to be true. Contemporary Jewish theologian Rabbi Neil Gilman offers that all human characterizations of God are necessarily metaphors borrowed from familiar human experience. Therefore, precisely because God transcends all of our own imaginings, we can only speak of God through the use of metaphor and poetry. Consider the fact that in the ancient world, as recorded in the Torah, to become aware of God meant grasping the eerie proximity of the divine's terrifying presence, as if that presence loomed just behind a curtain that separated this world from the next. And in the Torah, in the Bible, when God alights on the scene, Professor James Kugel, professor of Jewish history and Hebrew literature at both Bar-Ilan University and Harvard University, writes, the Torah describes these visiting dignitaries, these personages who come to meet the patriarchs and matriarchs. The Torah describes them as just regular folk. We, the omniscient reader, understand that they are divine emissaries, but our patriarchs and matriarchs had no such appreciation. They are found to be angels. They are found to be luminaries, mysterious beings from another world, and then, once they are appreciated as such divine messengers, they become just regular people. When in time our biblical forebears come to understand who their visitors truly are, the Torah then stops using the term angel or divine messenger, and thereafter refers to these characters simply as God. Today, as we gather on Rosh Hashanah morning, I suggest to you that our ancestors' discovery of God in their personal experience can serve us as the lens through which we can aspire and recapture the experience of God in our own lives. And it is for this reason that in my turning my son Michael's question over and over again, as he asked, how did God create himself, I came to the conclusion that the question is not best asked in the way he formulated it, which is to ask what brought about God, or how did God come to be? For to ask the question in this way is to suggest that God entered the world once and forevermore, but never again. Instead, I suggest that we ought to be asking ourselves another question, a different facet of Michael's query, and ask instead, what brings about God? How does God come to be? I suggest this because I believe that if God possesses any single quality worthy of the divine name, it must be timelessness. That God is without beginning and without end, and then therefore God cannot be limited to a single moment or a single event that can be plotted along the historical timeline. Therefore, to begin to answer the question as to how God created God, we must be willing to imagine that act, that occurrence, the occasions when God enters the world and the moment God enters consciousness, these are moments that are part of an ongoing series of acts of creation and Genesis that may be performed again and again and again. But the question still echoes, Daddy, that's fine, but how did God create himself? Do you remember the story of the young primary grade student who comes home one day and asks, where did I come from? To which the child's parents, who have long anticipated this question, sit their youngster down and pull an age-appropriate book off the shelf, begin to engage in a conversation that they have practiced themselves many times, and begin to explain that when would-be parents want to bring new life into the world, this is what needs to take place. Having finished their explanation, they turn to their child and ask, so have we answered your question? To which the child responds, I guess so, but Billy's from Cleveland, and I want to know where I come from. Where then does God come from? And how do we explain God's existence? How do we make it so in our own lives? We turn back to this morning's Torah portion. For just a few verses after we read of God creating heaven and earth, we come upon verses that describe how each one of us and everyone who has ever lived, all of us having been created b'tselem Elohim, we read how each one of us has been created in the divine image, in the image of God. That is, within each of us there's a divine spark, a reflection of the Holy One, a part of God, if you will. What this means is that God can be discovered whenever we look into the eyes of the face of another human being, whenever we recognize in another person that which we would hope to be recognized in ourselves. When we are able to discern that within us and between us there is something special, something precious, something holy, something sacred, the very image of God, then we appreciate what it is to be b'tselem Elohim. Then we come to understand some of the secret of what it means to be created in the image of God. For there's a connection between us, each and every human being on the planet. And in a very real way, this connection is the godly part of us that inspires acts of compassion and courage, empathy, and the emotion that binds us one to another. And in this way, the godlike parts of us allow us to have feelings for one another, such that for our experiencing these connections, we can help to heal one another when we are hurting. We can help to understand one another when we are feeling misunderstood or alone. And it is this which allows us to desire and to feel and to share and to create love. Before there was a world, I suggest to you, God wasn't anywhere because there was no place for God to be. And then once the world came into being, and once there were human beings to reflect the image of God, then God, as it were, came into the fullness of existence. Now, some of you who are more quick than I might ask quickly, well, if there were no people on earth, then does that mean there would be no God? Let me answer that question with another. This time the question is from Michael's older brother, Adam. Some time ago, Adam asked me, if when we hold hands, God is within our hands. Yes and no, I replied. We don't refer to hand-holding as God, and yet, if you hold someone's hand in order to keep them safe, if you hold someone's hand in order to keep them warm, if you hold someone's hand in order to reassure them or to just let them know you care, then yes. The answer is yes. When we act compassionately, God is right there in our hands. And yet, when we raise our hand to one another, when we clench our hands in a fist to hurt one another, when we push someone away or we selfishly close our hands to each other, when we intentionally mean to frustrate others by withholding our generosity, then no. In the absence of our acting humanely, I suggest to you it is as if God does not exist at all. In this way, we can see that God can be realized or removed by how we behave toward one another and how we treat the world around us. Do you remember when you would make an ugly face and your mom or dad would warn you that if you weren't careful, your face might just stay that way? Well, I suggest this morning that how we behave and how we treat one another will also determine whether our world will stay as it looks today. And so it is that when we behave well, we can truly say we have a hand in creating the conditions for God. Given the political climate we currently endure domestically, and given the terrible self-justified violence we read about each morning in our papers and see splashed across our screens, I don't need to tell you how desperately the world needs people who are thoughtful and sensitive and kind. The world is waiting for us to be the people we are capable of being. On this day of Rosh Hashanah, the world is waiting for us to be the people we were created to be. Because when we act in these good and holy and loving ways, when we reflect the image of God in which we have each been created, it is in these ways that we make real in the world the godlike qualities within us, and so it is through our actions, how we behave, that in Michael's words, God himself is created. And so to my son Michael, who asked, and to each of you, in response to the question, how did God create himself? On this first day of the new year, on this first day of the rest of our lives, I say, we do it. We create. We actualize. It is you and I who bring God into the world. Each time we extend our hand to another in friendship, each time we pause long enough to hear another's plea, each time we are humble or patient enough to hear another in their silence. And 2, each time we are understanding and we are sensitive. Each time we are slow to anger and quick to forgive. Whenever we act in these holy ways, it is as if God is right here with us, within our hands, within our hearts. And so, to Michael, to Adam, to all the children at heart who are here within my voice, on this Rosh Hashanah morning, on this first day of our new year, as we gather to celebrate the world's coming into being, in answer to the question, how did God create himself? We answer in the best way we know how, with a little help from God's friends. Shana Tova.